Mental.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm glad to speak in support of the changes in this bill that strengthen the incredible and vital public good that is the Australian Public Service. Deputy Speaker, if you set out to write a list of the key components that make Australia a place and a community that is functional and fair, that is capable and considerate, that rises to new and often difficult challenges like climate change, natural disasters and global pandemic, if you wanted to write that short list, the Australian Public Service would be right at the top, right at the very top. It's an extension of our system of democratic government, and it's the enabling force that implements the decisions we make as a community. As my colleague has just said, the Australian Public Service operates across a broad range of areas of Australian life, almost every area of Australian life that you can think of, and it operates from the person to person on the ground level, right up to the level at which policies are formulated and advice is given, that allows those of us in this place to make decisions and implement policies and programs and direct funding in the interests of Australia's broad well-being. This bill implements recommendations from the 2019 independent review of the APS, the so-called THODI review that was implemented by Prime Minister Turnbull. It does things like ensuring that there are 5-year capability reviews, delivering greater transparency and reinforcing, very importantly, the apolitical independence of the Australian Public Service, one of its great qualities, one of the most significant foundational principles of a democratic system like ours. The fact that it's this Labor government, the Albanese Labor government, that is implementing those recommendations is a good thing, but it does also fit a pattern that in some ways is a disappointing reflection on what has gone in the past, because these were recommendations made in 2019. We're 4.5 years on from that, and I remember being in the last parliament under the previous government where at times in the course of a sitting week, nothing much was going on. The government was scratching around for something to bring into this place for us to consider. You would have thought that the changes that were recommended in 2019 might have come forward in the course of the last parliament at some point, but no. It falls to us to do a very, very important repair job with respect to the Australian Public Service, because it has been run down, it has been pushed under, it has been chopped up into bits. It has been subject to unfair criticism. It's had its independence put at risk by all of the things that the former coalition government did. So we're coming along and we're starting to turn around the ship. And as I said, it follows a pattern, because we had, under the previous government, the Aged Care Royal Commission. Most of the recommendations of that were not implemented by the former government. We're getting on and doing that. We had the Graham Samuels review of the EPBC, the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, which said clearly to the government, the former coalition government, you need to do something to improve environmental protection at a time when the Australian environment has been hammered in and is under significant threat. It's on a trajectory of decline. Graham Samuels said, here's a fairly simple recipe for effective reform. That was ignored. Of course, we had the Constitutional Convention process in the form of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which the previous government initiated and then promptly ignored. So it was disappointing and a failure, really, of what the Australian community is entitled to expect in the form of competent government. That the coalition, in many cases, initiated a review process, and then off the back of that, had the recipe, had the ingredients for positive and much-needed reform, and just never got around to it. Did nothing. What's sadder still is that if all they had done was nothing, that wouldn't be as bad as what actually occurred, because when it comes to the Australian Public Service, whilst not undertaking the reforms that we're implementing, and whilst not supporting, championing, resourcing, enabling the Australian Public Service, the former government actually did its best or its worst, depending on how you want to describe it, to undermine the vital role that the APS plays by cutting funding, by cutting staff numbers, by putting in place pay freezes, by undermining the incredible work of the Community and Public Sector Union, which has always stood up for public sector workers, but more importantly has always stood up for what the Australian Public Service delivers to the Australian community. They have fought a war of resistance effectively for 9 or 10 years, while their members and all workers in the APS were treated to cut after cut after cut and squeeze after squeeze after squeeze. The ABC and the SBS had resources cut. The social safety net in almost all of its aspects was put under pressure, was subject to not death by 1,000 cuts, but we're on the path. It was sort of halfway to death, probably 491 cuts or something like that. 40% was cut out of the Department of the Environment alone. And what did we see as a result of that? As I said before, we've seen ourselves end up in what is effectively an extinction crisis, where even the former government's approach to environmental decline biodiversity was the threatened species strategy. That wasn't properly resourced. It was another colourful pamphlet whose objectives weren't met. In one part of that, you took the 20 most at-risk mammal species, and the idea was that you'd see improved trajectories in the population of those species within a 5-year period. Pretty sensible way of going about it, you would have thought. What actually happened? Well, there was an improvement in the trajectory of only 8 species, not even the 20 target species, only 8 of those 20 species. And in the case of 4 of the improved trajectories, it wasn't actually that you saw an increase in the population of that particular species, whether it's the Gilbert's potteroo, the most endangered mammal in Australia, whose home range is in the electorate of the member for O'Connor. You didn't see an improved population, you just saw slower decline. So I remember at one point the government saying, well, we haven't managed to improve trajectories for 20 species, but we have for 8. The truth was that with respect to 4 out of those 8, the population was still declining, just not quite as quickly as it had done before. That was the kind of thing that happened, and you could expect would happen when you cut 40% of the funding to the Department for the Environment. Not only do you get those terrible kinds of environmental and biodiversity outcomes, you also get slower decision-making, less reliable decision-making, faulty decision-making effectively. I think the ANAO, when it looked at decisions made under the EPBC, found that in the case of 79% of those decisions, there were conditions that had not been observed, and the government had failed to take hold of the fact that you've got effectively 80% or 4 in 5 rate of failure with respect to conditions that were attached to those decisions and were the basis on which those approvals were given. Immigration, Deputy Speaker. I mean, I don't think any of us would struggle to understand how important it is that Australia's immigration system works well, has integrity, works smoothly, is accessible and works in a timely way. We would all have constituents and probably in some cases members of our family who have been through that process. We have seen in recent times, issues that have arisen that amount to a kind of a crisis effectively when it comes to immigration processing. One only has to think of what happened with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the fact that the Immigration Department, which had been knocked back so badly that you had these enormous backlogs and enormous delays and lack of capacity, essentially meant that family members of Australian citizens from Afghanistan who are waiting to be able to come to Australia were prevented from doing so and now effectively find themselves locked in a country that has returned to Taliban rule with all of the things that implies. I mean, you know, these are when you talk about undermining the Australian public service, it's not just the fact that an age pensioner might have to wait for an hour on the telephone. That's intolerable. That shouldn't occur to an older Australian. But when you think that there are people whose family members were waiting for month after month after month and year after year after year just to have their migration application process, give them the chance to join their kids or their parents or their brothers and sisters here in Australia, and instead find that because of that failure, that lack of capacity and under-resourcing, that the door slams shut and that they are now stuck in circumstances that are literally grave circumstances that put their lives at risk. Customs and biosecurity, another of those critical areas that underpin our broad social and economic and environmental well-being. If you don't resource the Australian Public Service properly and you see failures in those areas, then the consequences can be devastating. Once a new invasive species comes in, the impact on agriculture particularly, but on other areas of our environment and our own well-being can be severely affected. The development assistance budget, probably one of the parts of the public service that was hit hardest. Certainly almost as soon as the former government was elected, they decided that they would smash Australia's development assistance program. They would dissolve AusAid altogether, and they would hammer the capacity that Australia has wielded so generously and so thoughtfully and effectively, particularly in our region, to reduce poverty and to reduce death, particularly for when it comes to infant mortality and for women and children as a sort of a focus group. That not only prevented us from saving lives, that not only prevented us from supporting the development of the stable, prosperous and sustainable economies in our region, but it did put our security at risk, because there's no better way to advance Australia's security, stability and prosperity than through well-targeted development assistance. No better way. And when you go along and you take out the resources, but you also take out the capability, the human capital, all those years of dedication, expertise, practical knowledge, networks, friendships, people-to-people bonds between Australians and people in countries in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia, you take away our capacity to be a significant, influential middle power acting for good. For good in the broadest sense, in accordance with our values and principles, in supporting the well-being of our brothers and sisters all over the world, and reducing conflict and reducing malnourishment and famine and disease and all of the terrible things that fortunately we don't experience to any significant degree in this country, but also advancing our own interests. If you are someone who doesn't find those other things compelling, if you don't find reducing infant mortality compelling, or lifting people out of grinding, aching poverty, freeing women from disease and domestic violence, if you don't find that compelling, you should at least find it compelling to think that when we assert our development assistance program and diplomacy and trade and all the parts of our sort of external affairs armature, when we extend and assert those parts of our public service capability well, we build our own security. We support our own ability to exist in a sustainably prosperous place with an environment that is looked after and in circumstances where conflict is minimalised. So the Labor Party will always support the Australian Public Service. We are under no illusion about its core significance to our way of life, to our system of democratic governance, and as an extension of our principles. The Australian Public Service has suffered over the last decade, like many parts of Australian life. Australian public servants have weathered that storm. There have been a lot of people who have been put under enormous pressure. They've been underpaid. They've had their job security risk. They've seen jobs outsourced. They've seen ridiculous contracts go to PwC and lots of other big companies at the cost of tens and tens of millions of dollars, where the quality of service that Australians expect has been smashed, and money has found its ways into the pockets of private companies, and our public service has been left to struggle on. We are going to change that this is the beginning. There's more work to be done.
The question is that the